little bit of chat GPT researching, and of course, that's not necessarily academically proper, but it'll help me to accelerate a very complex belief system that I'm not usually akin to absorb myself with too much. And that belief system is communism. And so, uh, fact check me on Oxford University Press and Harvard University Press and Yale University Press. Go to the academic books and check the facts if you want to get the straight answers. But I'm going to say stuff that ChatGPT told me, and I'm going to go with it for now. And like I said, fact check me with the academics to see if I'm right or wrong. Number one, Karl Marx was an atheist, so I don't like him already. Okay? Because Psalm 14:1 says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." So we're dealing with the fool, folks, already. Okay? But sometimes fools can write things that seem to make sense at points, and they can publish books and influence millions of people. And Karl Marx was such a person. Apparently, Karl Marx wasn't evil and nefarious as some people have made him out to be, um, because Karl Marx wrote in the early 1800s, and communist superstates began with Joseph Stalin about 100 years later in Russia. So there's a 100-year gap between Karl Marx and Joseph Stalin. So there needs to be a line that's drawn between Marxism and Stalinism, between Marx and Stalin, between Karl Marx and Joseph Stalin. There's a 100-year gap between these two men in the development of communism. And everything that is evil and corrupt about communism was lived out and acted out by Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. And so practically everything that went wrong in communist Russia could be blamed on Joseph Stalin, not on Karl Marx. For example, the atheist dictatorship. That concept does not come from Karl Marx. It comes from Joseph Stalin. Dictatorship does not come from Karl Marx, but comes from Joseph Stalin inheriting a tradition of dictatorship from the Russian czars that came before. Right? The czars of Russia, CZAR or TSAR. The Russians have a very, very long tradition of tyrannical kings called czars. And then so when Joseph Stalin rose to power, he augmented the Marxist ideology and even assassinated his own Marxist co-workers who disagreed with him, like Trotsky. So Trotsky was a true Marxist that worked with Joseph Stalin, and correct me if I'm wrong, he had Trotsky assassinated because Trotsky was too democratic for Stalin's czarist tyrannical ways. So Stalin modified Marxism, which is far more democratic, apparently, in its ideology. Stalin modified Marxism into a very Russian sort of czar, tyrannical king sort of an idea. Okay? And then it was easy for this to transfer over to China because the Chinese have centuries and millennia of tyrannical emperor sort of mentalities over there. So really, communism is apparently not the reason why tyrants have ruled Russia and China. The reason is the kings and the emperors And the czars go way, way back with this. Those are authoritarian countries, in other words. And so when they took communism, honestly, it's just another form of authoritarianism that they modified to fit their needs. They've always been authoritarian, in other words. Communism didn't make them authoritarianism. Communism helped them to modify the authoritarianism that already existed in those countries. So if Stalin was a reader of Karl Marx, he would not have been a dictator, because Marx apparently was more of a democratic type of a person. So uh, Marx was really big on, and Hitler wrote a book that got him popular. He wrote a book called Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle. And Hitler didn't like Karl Marx's ideas, which is why Hitler also became an authoritarian tyrant, because Germany has a long-standing tradition of authoritarianism and dictatorship. So again, in the case of Hitler, in the case of Stalin, and in the case of Mao Zedong, the Chinese, in the case of Germany, Russia, and China, these tyrannical authoritarian dictators all had to modify and reject the democratic aspects of Karl Marx in order to do what they did to communism. They modified communism. They modified it to take on an authoritarian structure. They had to modify it. They only took the parts out of Marx that helped them to make their countries more authoritarian. But they ignored the parts of Marx that would have made their countries more democratic, essentially. All right, that's the first thing I wanted to get across, is that Germany, the Kaisers, right before Germany, authoritarian tyrants. Okay, Russia, the Tsars before communism, authoritarian tyrants. And in China, the emperors before communism, authoritarian tyrants. The problem with these three countries is that they had authoritarian dictatorship in the structure of the countries already before communism even came into being. Communism is not the source of dictatorship. Authoritarian king type, top-down king type culture is the source of dictatorship, not communism. Okay. However, why did communism empower these guys? Why did it empower them? Because communism teaches people to trust the state. Capitalism teaches people to question the state, to empower the individual, whereas communism teaches people to give more money to the state and trust the state. So basically communism, the way Karl Marx envisioned it, was more to be based around trade unions, okay? And so a trade union, like for example, if a person was a blue-collar worker and they're working in an assembly line, right? A union, all right, of assembly line workers, those guys are voting on policy. That was Karl Marx's idea. The trade union concept is Karl Marx's idea, right? But what somehow along the way they took bits and pieces out of Karl Marx and they cobbled together this dictatorship thing. And another thing is the atheist thing. Karl Marx was personally an atheist, okay? But he did not believe in state atheism. That was Stalin doing that. Stalin is the person who made up that idea, okay? Karl Marx was personally an atheist, and Karl Marx did not believe in having a state church. Karl Marx believed that every person should have their own belief, whether it's Christian or atheist or whatever your own personal belief is, and it's an individual thing. Karl Marx did not like the idea of personal philosophical beliefs and personal religious beliefs becoming part of the government. So Stalin created the state. They went from the state church of Russian Orthodox Church being the state church of Russia, to atheism being the state ideology of Russia. So that was already in place in Russia before. That was a modification of Stalin, the state atheism thing. It went from state Christianity, Russian Orthodox Church, to state atheism. Right? That's not a Marxist idea. That doesn't come from Karl Marx at all. Karl Marx believed that religion should be a personal matter, or if you're an atheist or an unbeliever, that's a personal matter, and the government should have absolutely no say in it. Karl Marx believed in that, and in that sense, he has more in common with American policy in that area. But Stalin changed all that. Stalin is the person who made state atheism the thing, and then the Chinese copied him and tons of other countries copied him. So Stalin is the true inventor of the persecution of Christians type communism that exists today. That voice of the martyrs communism that Richard Wurmbrand built his entire ministry against. That comes from Stalin. Now, Richard Wurmbrand also wrote a book called Marx and Satan, and I have not read it yet. And he spends an entire book trying to demonstrate that Karl Marx sold his soul to the devil, and he was some type of an atheistic Satanist like Anton LaVey. I can believe that. Like, anybody who's builds an entire lifestyle off of atheism has got to be pretty deranged. Okay, so I'm not defending Karl Marx. What I'm saying, though, is that Karl Marx's economic philosophy seems to be more American than what ended up happening in Russia and China. That's all I'm trying to say. Being said, ChatGPT tells me that Bernie Sanders thinks more like Karl Marx and less like Stalin and less like Mao Zedong. Yeah, you know what? I'm still skeptical because Stalinism has dominated the communist countries for 100 years. So don't try to put one off on me, Sanders. Okay? Although he does kind of have a long history of being an American political figure. I mean, he's worked in our system. So maybe he's more like Trotsky. Who knows? But here's the danger in the whole thing. Okay? Atheism. And the history of communism. So try to tell me that communism 2.0 is going to work, or communism 3.0, called democratic socialism. I'm not persuaded. I am not persuaded. I'm skeptical of any system of government that leaves Christ out of it. I am. You might say, well, that's state religion. Okay, I am. Because I know that Fox's Book of Martyrs was based off of state Christianity going wrong. I understand that. And I understand that Voice of the Martyrs is the result of state atheism going wrong. I can agree that martyrs are going to happen anytime state religion or state atheism is present. But we have mentally ill people assassinating Charlie Kirk, so explain that. I think that terrorist groups need to be identified and arrested. Why don't we just rest on that point?